The national spirits which become conscious of their essence in the shape of a particular animal coalesce into a single spirit. Thus it is that the separate, beautiful national spirits unite into a single pantheon, the element and habitation of which is language. The pure intuition of itself as universal humanity has in the actuality of the national spirit this form. The national spirit combines with the others with which it constitutes through nature a single nation in a common undertaking, and for this task forms a collective nation and therewith a collective heaven. This universality to which spirit in its existence attains is, however, only this first universality which first issues from the individuality of the ethical sphere, which has not yet overcome its immediacy, has not yet formed a single state out of its peoples. The ethical life of the actual national spirit rests partly on the immediate trust of the individuals in their nation as a whole, partly on the direct share which all, regardless of differences of class, take in the decisions and actions of the government. In the Union, which to begin with is not a permanent arrangement but only for the purpose of a common action, that freedom of participation by each and all is, for the time being, put on one side. This first alliance is, therefore, more an assembly of individualities than their domination by an abstract thought which would rob the individuals of their self-conscious participation in the will and deed of the state. Paragraph 727 is the first in a new subsection, and this is a third and final subsection of the second section of the religion portion of the work. And there's a lot going on here that we're going to have to unpack. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about all these sections and how things fit in with each other. A little bit of commentary on that to give us a reminder of where we are and how close we are to the end of this long dialectical journey through consciousness and history that Hegel calls the Phenomenology of Spirit. So let's back up a little bit. We are in this penultimate section, which is called religion. And this comes after the preface and the introduction, all that interesting material. Then the rather abstract consciousness section, the more concrete and richer self-consciousness section, in which the key idea of recognition or acknowledgement, anerkennen, takes front and center as a value that's going to be worked out through the rest. Then we have this massive reason section, an even larger spirit section. Then we finally come to a shorter section, religion, which is bringing together all of these previous dialectics and going back over some old ground, but also introducing some new things. And here, Hegel is once again talking primarily about Greece and perhaps by extension Rome as the ethical nation par excellence, because he is, essentially a pro-Hellen, pro-Greek kind of person, the way many of these Germans were at that time. But a lot of the things that he's saying could be extended to other types of the word that he's going to bring up here, pantheons, right? What is a pantheon? It comes from Greek, pan, all, and then theos, God or divinity. And so this is the Ganzheit, the totality of the Greek gods. Actually, not all of them, because as we've seen, there are the Chthonian gods as well, but we're going to overlook that for just a moment. And so we are getting now into something that's going to be really distinctively connected to art, but art in a different way than we've encountered so far. What have we been looking at so far? We could talk about primarily visual and even tactile art. We began by looking at crystalline shapes and plants and animals and the sun itself and all of these nature things that then could be worked into forms, gestalten, by, at first, a craftsperson, the Werkmeister, and then by the artist, and we get the statue, we get the temple, now we've got architecture. And then we talked about this entire range of things that fit into the cult, the cultus in Hegel's German, and there's a lot going on there. We talked about some preliminary forms of language that play an important role within that, the oracle, the hymn, the frenzied ravings of the crowd that's inhabited by the god, filled with enthusiasm. That's what enthusiasm literally means. And then in the last paragraph, we brought up this new kind of use of language, not new necessarily historically, although I suppose you could say that what we're going to talk about here is, in fact, historically coming later, as we'll see in just a moment when we mention these kinds of language. And it's going to take on now we could call it intelligibility that it didn't have in the previous paragraph in the last subsection. It was being mentioned, but not being adequately explained. It's not going to be fully explained in this paragraph either. That's coming throughout this entire subsection. But what are we talking about? Poetry. And when we hear that word poetry today, there's often a tendency to associate it with the sort of things that we're more familiar with, like, little rhymes, roses are red, violets are blue, blah, 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 right? Put whatever else you want in there. Things that we see in greeting cards. Yes, that's poetry, sure. Or we associate it with, poetry slam, people getting up in front of a crowd in a coffee house and having that poetic diction that they use with it, right? And that's actually a little bit closer to ancient poetry. Ancient poetry was meter-based. It wasn't so much about rhyming things. It was about conveying important ideas. It wasn't necessarily so much about your own ideas as you expressing yourself in your place and time or your experiences. Although there was lyric poetry for that, right? We have, Sappho writing about love, and we have Archilochus, and we have all these other people writing lyric poetry, including Solon, right? Writing about politics to some degree. But that's not what we're talking about here either. We're talking about other genres of poetry that are conveying something, we could say, less individual, less individuated, less sunk into its individuality, and more universal, as we're going to see in the text here and as we're going to see in the paragraphs yet to come. So when we're talking about language, Sprache here, what kind of language do we actually mean? Well, if you read ahead in this subsection, which, by the way, I strongly suggest you should be watching these videos, and that you should not be hitting on this paragraph for the first time. You'd probably want to read the whole subsection before you watch these commentaries, because then you have some idea where you're going, right? You're not just going along for the ride. First, Hegel is going to talk about epic. And we're going to discuss this at great length, but we should say a little bit about that in just a minute. And then where are we going after epic? Tragedy. Now, with tragedy, we have no longer something that is just recited or later on written down. We have something that is actually performed and involves more than one person as the main speaker. I mean, with epic, you could have kind of call and response if you wanted to, but it's still a main person who is being translated here in the paragraphs to come is a minstrel, but we often say bard, right? Or the storyteller, the reciter. With tragedy, we actually have plays, and plays involve a stage and actors and a chorus and all these other elements that wind up being discussed by Aristotle in Poetics, the one book that we still have of it, book 1. And then after that, Hegel is going to discuss the counterpart to tragedy, which is comedy. Comedy is also drama. Comedy is also done on a stage. Now, of course, you can do comedy in other ways. Think about stand-up, where one person gets in front of a mic and talks about, whatever is going on in their life. What's the deal about airline food or whatever other silly stuff that they want to bring up, right? But comedic plays were done on a stage like tragedies. And, there were other kinds of plays as well, the Sadler plays. We don't actually have that much of Greek drama preserved as we'd like, much the same with most ancient literature. But we have enough to have a pretty solid idea about what was going on. So those are going to be the modes of language, of discourse, that Hegel is going to devote attention to here. And we could say, well, what does that got to do with religion? Well, on a very basic level, the gods play some part in epic, actually a significant part, right? If the epics that we have in mind are the Iliad and the Odyssey, the gods are characters and also determiners within it. They also play some role sometimes in the tragic and even comedic works. So there's content, but there's also another important feature. These things were done as ways of relating to the gods. Sometimes people say silly things like, Homer was the Bible of, the ancient Greeks. And the Bible doesn't actually make sense to say that because ta biblia is a Greek word that comes about later on after we put these things together. But it was held in a certain kind of reverence, these works. So it does make some sense to do that. Just don't push that analogy too hard because it'll fall apart very quickly. So that's something we need to keep in mind when we're seeing this discussion of language or Sprache. There's one other thing I would like to mention before we turn to the text. So this section is the spiritual work of art, right? Geistige, right? And the previous section was the living work of art, and before that we had the abstract work of art. Now, did Hegel pick those terms just willy-nilly? No, there's a point to it. We go from something that is more static, less well-articulated, less self-conscious, although self-consciousness is deeply involved with it and trying to make its way through it. We go from something that's abstract to something that is living. Life, for Hegel, is something more than the merely abstract. Or even, you could say, there's a transition going on in nature from the one to the other. But life, by itself, does not yet have a meaning or a questioning of meaning or an attempt to reconcile these things. Life reproduces itself. Life consumes. Life enjoys. But life does not provide the kind of focus and development that Geist, spirit, mind provides. And that is something that is being worked out through this medium. And notice what else he says. Habitation of language. So let's now turn to the text after having said all of that. One thing I want to point out right off the bat. Miller's translation makes it a little bit tricky at points to differentiate different German terms that are being used, particularly if we look at the previous paragraph in the earlier subsection and this paragraph right here. When Hegel is talking about national spirits, he's actually using two different terms there. So one is Folkgeister, right? So folk is folk is something that can be translated as nation. It's like the Greek ethnos. It doesn't yet mean anything like what we are going to talk about here, a state, but it does signify people that are bound together by not just blood, but much more important, by meaning, by shared history and narratives, by understanding each other, by, as we're going to talk about in a moment, trust as well. So, folk, Geister, right? That is one thing. And then we have, as we just had earlier, Nationalgeister, national spirit. And here Hegel will talk not about that, but about a nation, single nation, einer Nation. He'll also specify this as something different than the state, Staat, right? We don't yet have a state, but we do have a nation, and we do have a folk in one sense, and we have Völker, the plural of folk, in another sense. There's a kind of binding, a kind of unifying going on here. And there's really three main things happening in this paragraph. We've got this initial part where we're talking about the development of a pantheon, and this is going to assume greater importance in the paragraphs yet to come. And then we have this discussion about the nation, which is connected with this, and this is why it's part of the religion section, right? The pantheon represents something that is happening with the formation of a nation and its ethical life. And then we have this common action, common project, you might say. And, one great prime example of this in epic that you can think about is the war against Troy, right? That is an example of a gemeinsamen Handlung, as we're going to see. But we could think of many others as well. The assembly of the Greeks against the Persian Empire, very important for Greek consciousness. And like I was saying earlier, we could apply this to other pantheons and other nations and ethnicities as well. So, he says, the national spirits, which become conscious of their essence, their Wesen, in the shape, the Gestalt of a particular animal, coalesce into a single spirit. So we have a plurality that are being united into one thing. And he says, thus it is that the separate, beautiful national spirits unite into a single pantheon, a single assembly of the gods. A single storyline, we could say as well, one overarching narrative universe. The element and habitation, Behausung, of which is language, Sprache. So now we know what we're talking about here in this new important use of language. It is what allows us to have this pantheon. It is what allows us to bring these different cults together. And they're gods. It's interesting that he uses the word beautiful, Shona, right? This is something that kind of corresponds, you could say, to the Greek kalon, beautiful, fine, noble, honorable, something that is good in a certain way, right? And so all of these are being brought to a kind of unity. He says, the pure intuition, Anschauung, of itself as, now notice what he says here, universal humanity. Universal humanity has in the actuality, the Wirklichkeit of the national spirit, this form. The national spirit, the Folkgeister, combines with the others with which it constitutes through nature, and here's where we get this other thing, a single nation. Now, notice what else he says here. It's not enough just to have we're a bunch of gods and we kind of need to pool our resources, or maybe we need to get all on one big plan so we don't bump into each other or something like that. Let's have a pantheon. That's not how it actually works here. It's not just that the gods decided this and then revealed it to humanity, and they're like, okay, you've been worshiping Poseidon up to this point. That's good, but you should also have a temple for Hera and a temple for Athena and a temple for Apollo. Oh, you don't want to build all those? Well, you can go to Delphi for Apollo and maybe worship there and get the oracle to tell you. That's not how it's working. A single nation, right? He also talks about a collective nation, Gesamtvolk, as we're going to see. A single nation, eine Nation, is being developed how? In a common undertaking, a common project, common job, something that motivates them. It could be external fighting against an enemy who is invading. It could be the games that are being held that unite, right? It could also be going and beating up those Trojans for taking Helen. Could be all sorts of things. And he says, for this task forms a collective nation, right? Gesamtvolk. So now it's no longer just folk, it's Gesamtvolk, a greater totality, which also is correlated to a collective heaven, Gesamthimmel. And what is that collective heaven? It is the location, both physical, you look up at the sky and you're maybe on Mount Olympus or something like that, but also in imagination and narrative of the pantheon, of these gods that are now being connected with each other. So he says that this universality to which spirit in its existence attains. Now, what universality? Universal humanity, right? Everybody who writes an epic or who engages in this sort of pantheon building views themselves as the model for humanity. Others are like them, but usually deficient. Think about the Greeks and how they had this kind of Goldilocks formula. Oh, we're the Greeks. We have just the right amount of thumos. Not like those crazy northern people, the Illyrians and the Celts and all those warlike people. And we're not like those supine, slavish Egyptians or Persians. We've got just the right amount. Well, that's pretty typical in the way that peoples frame things for themselves. So this universality to which spirit in its existence attains is only this first universality, which first issues from the individuality of the ethical sphere, which has not yet overcome its immediacy, not yet formed a state out of its peoples. So this is prior to the state, and there's still governance going on. There's still ruling, Regierung. There we go. There's still a common task, probably a common enemy that's at play. And so he says here, what do we have? Ethical life, Sittlichkeit, right? Following the mores, developing the mores further, expressing them. The ethical life of the actual, wirklich, national spirit rests, and here he says two really important things, rests partly, teils in German, on the immediate trust of the individuals in their nation as a whole, and partly on the direct share which all, regardless of difference of class, take in the decisions and actions of the government. Okay, so this is really key and central. Not only do we have a connection with sort of, the realm of ideas and language and representation going on here, we also have something that's happening in the nation that is coming together as a single nation Eine Nation, as a collective nation, a Gesamtvolk. And it's happening on two bases. We have the immediate trust, Vertrauen, and that's something that we have to unpack, of individuals in their nation as a whole, ein Ganz, right, as a totality, not as the only nation, but as their nation, as their folk, as their ethnos. And this trust is not just sort of a blind, identification of, oh, well, I'm an Athenian, and Athenians are the best, and Athens is so wonderful. It's not just something like patriotism, in its debased form. In order to be a people, you have to have, you could say trust, or you could say confidence that collective action is possible, that collective ways of looking at things make sense, that the language that you use is actually going to be received. We don't think about this most of the time, but that's there. That's there in societies, civilizations, nations, states, across, things that unite us all, like, say, the internet. That trust is really an important element here. So that's one thing that's going on. A direct share, Anteil, in what? The actions, the Handlung, and the decisions, Urteilen, of the government, of the ruling class, the ruling people, the Regierung, right? And so he says, regardless of difference of class or occupation or whatever, this direct share which they take in the actions and decisions of the government. And then he says, in the union, which to begin with is not a permanent arrangement like that of the state would be, right? But only for the purpose of a common action, ein Handlung, right? Gemeinsamen Handlung, something that everybody wants to get accomplished, even though they may have different ways of looking at it. A great example of this is, in the Iliad, right? We see conflicts between people about precisely what they ought to do or how things ought to be done. It's not as if they're all in complete unanimity about the means, but there is some sort of common end. And so he goes on and he says, in the union, which is not a permanent arrangement, but only for the purpose of a common action, that freedom of participation by all and each is, for the time being, put on one side. They have to have some organization, right? They have to have war leaders. Not everybody can be the general. But he calls this the first alliance. Is a long term. Gemeinschaftlichkeit. A being bound together in something like being part of the same Gemeinschaft, the same, ethical community. Very often in German, Gemeinschaft is connected with Sitten, right? And then it's being contrasted to Gesellschaft, which is a more thought out arrangement, something that may have developed historically, but is closer to morality in the Hegelian sense. So he goes on and he says, this first alliance is more an assembly of individualities than their domination by an abstract thought, which would rob the individuals of their self-conscious participation in, now notice this, the will, Wille, that's just will, and the deed, Tat. Now, he doesn't say of the state, as Miller translates it here. Rather, it's the Ganz, right, of the totality, of the group, you could say. So state isn't being brought up here, but rather what we have going on, this common action being guided by somebody running the show, giving some sort of order to it. But it's not an Ordnung. It's not a rigid, for all times, self-consciously thought out ordering. And now we can say, well, okay, so we've come a long way. How do we get from this stuff back to the Pantheon? Aren't we talking about the gods? Well, yes, because the gods and this language are going to play a role in this common action. Iliad's a great example. The gods fight on either side, right? As a matter of fact, Athena actually sets up a hit on Aphrodite by the human being, the hero Diomedes, who she, allows to be able to see Aphrodite. He sticks her with a spear. So there's a lot of interaction going on there. We could talk about that sort of stuff all day in examples. But these are all connected with each other. And so this is some, I think, useful stage setting as we move forward with the rest of this very interesting subsection in which we're going to be talking about epic, tragedy, comedy, and some other key things like necessity, individuality, and how we understand the gods in relation to human beings.